What happens when the cost of a single meal becomes a day's wage? In the Philippines, where food prices have skyrocketed beyond reach, families are making impossible choices, skipping meals, rationing rice, and counting coins just to survive. This isn't just a story about hunger, it's a story about a nation on the brink. How did the middle class in the Philippines go from comfortable to counting coins for a meal? In 2025, even those who once enjoyed stable incomes are now struggling to keep food on the table as prices soar to unprecedented levels. The people who once filled their carts without a second thought are now rationing rice and skipping protein. Their salaries no longer enough to cover basic groceries. The numbers tell a devastating story. Food prices have surged by over 30% in just a year, while wages have barely budged. The cost of a kilo of rice is now equivalent to an entire day's pay for some workers. Families who once considered themselves financially secure are now standing in line at food banks, their dignity hanging by a thread. But this is only the beginning. As the gap between income and food prices widens, desperation is growing. What happens when those who were once the backbone of the economy start going hungry? In the next segment, we uncover how parents are making heartbreaking sacrifices to feed their children, and what they're giving up to do it. What would you sacrifice to keep your children fed? Across the Philippines, parents are skipping meals so their kids can eat, a silent crisis playing out in kitchens nationwide. A mother in Manila says, "I'm not hungry," as she hands the last piece of bread to her son, her own stomach empty since yesterday. This isn't an isolated story, it's a reality for millions of Filipino parents who are making gut-wrenching choices every single day. The statistics are as heartbreaking as they are alarming. Over 60% of low-income families report skipping meals at least once a week, not because they're dieting, but because they can't afford the basics. And it's not just the unemployed, even those working 2 or 3 jobs are barely scraping by. When food prices rise faster than wages, hunger doesn't discriminate, it devours everyone in its path. But what happens when the sacrifice becomes routine? When hunger becomes the norm rather than the exception? In the next segment, we follow former OFWs who once sent money home to feed their families but are now struggling to feed themselves. A cruel twist in a nation that once thrived on overseas remittances. Imagine leaving your country to provide for your family, only to come back and struggle to put food on the table. That's the harsh reality for many former overseas Filipino workers in 2025. Once the backbone of the Philippine economy, they sent billions in remittances to keep their families afloat. But now, with food prices soaring and jobs scarce, they're the ones rationing rice and skipping meals. A bitter irony for those who once sacrificed everything to support loved ones abroad. For some, the struggle is even more pronounced. A former seafarer who once earned in dollars now juggles 2 part-time jobs, barely earning enough to buy a kilo of fish. Another ex-housekeeper who worked in Dubai for over a decade now finds herself lining up at food banks, her savings drained and her pride in tatters. It's a stark reminder that the overseas dream can quickly turn into a nightmare when the cost of living at home spirals out of control. But the pain doesn't end there. As the economic landscape shifts, entire communities are left scrambling to survive. Next, we explore the hidden battlefronts of food deserts, places where even a simple meal has become a luxury, and fresh produce is as rare as a steady income. ChatGPT Dissy. What if you lived in a place where fresh food was as rare as a paycheck? In the Philippines, entire neighborhoods are turning into food deserts, areas where fresh produce is a luxury and processed junk food is the only affordable option. From urban slums to remote villages, families are relying on instant noodles and canned goods to get by, their diets stripped of essential nutrients as prices for fruits and vegetables soar beyond reach. In some rural provinces, the situation is even worse. Farmers who once grew their own crops are now selling everything they harvest just to cover rising debts, leaving their own tables empty. Meanwhile, city dwellers spend hours commuting to markets that still carry fresh produce, only to walk away empty-handed, unable to afford even a handful of bananas. This isn't just about hunger, it's about being cut off from the very food that once sustained a nation. But what happens when even those with jobs can no longer afford to eat properly? In the next segment, we dive into the cities where the cost of living is skyrocketing and workers are finding themselves priced out of basic necessities. A grim reality for those who once thought they'd never go hungry. What good is a paycheck when the price of food keeps climbing? In cities like Manila, Cebu, and Davao, the cost of living has become a crushing weight for workers who once considered themselves middle class. Teachers, nurses, and office clerks are now rationing meals, sharing cramped apartments, and skipping meat to make their money stretch through the month. The skyline may be dotted with high-rise buildings, but on the ground, people are barely scraping by. The numbers paint a bleak picture. Rent has jumped by over 40% in the last year, while food prices have soared by 30%. A construction worker in Quezon City says he builds luxury condos he could never afford to live in, while his children eat rice with salt for dinner. For those living in supposedly prosperous cities, the cost of survival is swallowing their paychecks whole. But this is just the surface. While the working class battles rising costs, another group is fighting an even more brutal war: students who are sacrificing their health and education just to stay afloat. In the next segment, we uncover the silent crisis of young Filipinos who are going to bed hungry, textbooks in hand. What's the price of education when your stomach is empty? In 2025, thousands of Filipino students are attending classes on empty stomachs, juggling textbooks and hunger pangs. These are future engineers, teachers, and nurses, young people who were told that education would be their ticket out of poverty. But with food prices skyrocketing and tuition fees climbing, many are choosing between meals and school supplies, a choice no student should ever have to make. For some, the struggle is relentless. A university student in Manila stretches a single pack of instant noodles across 3 meals, while another in Cebu skips lunch to save enough for a photocopy of his final exam review. According to recent reports, nearly half of college students from low-income families are experiencing food insecurity, a silent crisis that threatens not only their health but their futures. But hunger doesn't just stop in the classroom. In the next segment, we dive into the world of gig workers, the drivers, delivery riders, and freelancers who spend hours delivering food they can't afford to eat themselves. Their struggle reveals a deeper truth about what it means to work in a nation where even those with jobs are going to bed hungry. Imagine delivering food all day and still going to bed hungry. That's the harsh reality for gig workers in the Philippines, the drivers, delivery riders, and freelancers who hustle from sunrise to sunset, only to earn just enough for a pack of instant noodles. These workers were promised flexibility and freedom, but instead, they're trapped in a cycle of exhaustion and food insecurity, delivering meals they can't afford to eat themselves. A food delivery rider in Quezon City says he spends hours weaving through traffic, hoping for decent tips that rarely come. Meanwhile, a freelance graphic designer in Cebu juggles 3 gigs but still skips breakfast to pay for internet data. According to recent studies, gig workers now make up over 20% of the country's workforce, yet most are earning less than the minimum wage after expenses, a cruel paradox in a system that markets itself as a path to financial independence. But for some, the struggle to put food on the table is compounded by another painful reality: being a migrant in their own country. Next, we turn our focus to former OFWs and other returning migrants who once sent money back home but are now fighting to feed their own families, a devastating twist in a country that once thrived on overseas remittances. What happens when the dream of a better life abroad turns into a nightmare back home? For former overseas Filipino workers, returning to the Philippines was supposed to mean stability and security. But in 2025, many are facing a cruel twist. The money they once sent back to feed their families is now barely enough to feed themselves. The very people who once sacrificed everything for their loved ones are now the ones struggling to survive. A former domestic worker who spent years in Dubai now spends her days in line at a food bank, her savings wiped out by rising food prices. Meanwhile, a seafarer who once earned in dollars now struggles to pay for a kilo of rice, his income from odd jobs barely covering rent. These are the untold stories of those who once carried the nation's economy on their backs, only to come home and find themselves drowning in a sea of debt and desperation. But even those with roofs over their heads are not safe from hunger. In the next segment, we enter the world of the homeless, the men, women, and children living on the streets, where food is not just scarce, it's a matter of life and death. This is the final chapter of our story, and it's one you won't want to miss. What if your only kitchen was a sidewalk and your only bed was a park bench? For the homeless in the Philippines, food insecurity isn't just a challenge, it's a daily battle for survival. In 2025, over 500,000 Filipinos are living without stable shelter, and with food prices soaring, Even basic meals have become nearly impossible to secure. From makeshift tents to crowded underpasses, the struggle to find the next meal is as relentless as the heat of the sun. A former jeepney driver now sleeps on a cardboard mat under a bridge, clutching a plastic bag with his last piece of bread. Meanwhile, a single mother and her 2 children share a corner of a bus terminal, surviving on leftovers given by street vendors. For those without kitchens, refrigerators, or even a safe place to eat, food becomes a fleeting, uncertain lifeline. A cruel twist in a country where malls are overflowing with excess. This is the final chapter of our story, but it's far from over. Hunger is not just a statistic, it's a silent epidemic that's tearing through the very fabric of the Philippines.